Hello, everybody. This is Seth with the World of Paleoanthropology, and today we are joined again by our friend Chris Stringer. Now, today we are discussing a very exciting topic, something very new to the anthropological community at large, and that is the Harbin skull, also known as Homo longi. Now, what can you tell us, Professor?
Okay, well, obviously I got involved in studying this fossil a couple of years ago. So Chinese colleagues invited me to join an ongoing project. Like many people, I first got to hear about this fossil in 2018 when some news reports came out of China with some pictures of it, suggesting it was a Homo heidelbergensis, that it might be 200, 300, 400,000 years old. And it was obviously an important, well-preserved fossil. And yes, a few months later, I was invited to join the study team. So this was a great opportunity for me. And it really is a beautiful fossil. And many people will have seen this, this familiar green replica 3D print of the
Why
fossil.
is it green?
That's the way the Chinese made it. This must be a popular material in China, I guess. Certainly very striking.
Definitely.
So yeah, so this here is a very accurate 3D print of the fossil. So you can see it is beautifully preserved, very large. We can compare it here. I've got a modern human, Broken Hill, and a Neanderthal, La Ferracine. So you can see just how massive it is. And of course, you can see why at first impressions it might be called a heidelbergensis, because it's got it's very big. It's got this very big brow ridge, big face, a long, low cranial vault. So that looks very heidelbergensis-like.
Right.
But when I saw the first photos, the face really didn't look like the typical Broken Hill face, with this rather more pulled out face with a rather inflated cheekbone, a bit more like a Neanderthal in that respect. So it looked like it had a much more modern looking face. So I was cautious about whether it could be a heidelbergensis. And then when I actually got hold of this replica, and when my colleagues sent me good photos, of course, we could see that the back of the skull, even though it's a huge skull, if this were a heidelbergensis, we would have a big occipital torus and an angled occiput here. And there is a mild occipital torus, but it's nothing like as big as even on Broken Hill. So if we look at Broken Hill, you can see this typical sort of morphology.
Yeah.
The other way that's reconstructed. You can see here on the original fossil, this big torus here and this strong angulation. So we don't see that on Harbin. So it looked distinct anyway. And of course, when we started to analyze it, it was clear that it had, its own combination of features which were unique compared with the other ones I've got here, compared with us, with the Neanderthals, and with heidelbergensis.
That is amazing. So a lot of the headlines, especially the ones that I've seen, is new species, new species, new species. Now, I know this is contended. It could be, well, what could it be?
Well, obviously, there's the whole issue of how we define, diagnose a species. So for some people, of course, all these things here, we should call them all Homo sapiens. And I obviously argue that, Neanderthals are distinct enough from us to be a distinct species, regardless of whether there is some interbreeding going on. And we know from modern mammal and bird data that closely related species may do a bit of interbreeding. And we and the Neanderthals certainly did. So for me, morphologically, though, these represent distinct lineages through time. They've evolved their own distinct sets of features. And on that basis, when we come to something like Harbin, it does have its own distinct combination of features. And the analyses we did and published showed that it grouped with some other Chinese fossils, such as Dali and Jinushan. It also grouped, interestingly, with a jawbone from the Tibetan Plateau of China, from Jiahe, which has been, thought to be maybe a Denisovans. So that Jiahe jawbone, people may wonder how you can have a jawbone and a skull combined together in an analysis. But of course, in the analyses we did, we put in skulls that had jaw bones. So for the computer analyses, that was all treated as data. We didn't tell the computer this is a jawbone, that's a skull. That was all data, and based on that data, basically the analyses more or less predicted that if there was a jawbone for Harbin, it would look like Chagi. So those combined together as a distinct group. So we had a Neanderthal clade, and that included the Scimitar Huesos material. We had a Sapiens clade, which included things like Jebel Ihud and Homo kibish. And we had this Chinese clade with a number of those fossils, which I've called China archaic. Some people have called them Chinese Heidelbergensis, but they were distinct. And interestingly, the Heidelbergensis fossils, including Bodo, Petrona, Arago, they were placed outside of those three clades. So we had a clade, and these were outgroups. These were less closely related to these. So these three formed a kind of super clade, if you like, of what you could call advanced Homo from the middle and late Pleistocene, and the Heidelbergensis things were outside of that grouping. So yeah. So then, is that a distinct species? Well, on the basis of the variation within the Neanderthalensis and the Sapiens groups, those Chinese things certainly formed a comparable grouping with, even a slightly less varied morphology than we find in the whole Heidelbergensis, in the whole Neanderthalensis grouping, or the whole Sapiens grouping. So for me, actually, I'm happy to group Harbin with Dali as a distinct species. And in that case, the name that would have priority is actually Homo daliensis. The Dali skull was originally called Homo sapiens daliensis. And if we make that a distinct species, that becomes Homo daliensis. So that name has priority. So actually, I'm quite happy to call this Homo daliensis. But some of my Chinese colleagues felt that even within the Chinese fossil grouping, it was distinct enough with the Xiahe jawbone to be called its own name, Homo longi, dragon man. And obviously that's a great popular name. I'm happy to use it. The press loved it. So, dragon man is a reasonable popular name for the grouping, but personally, I prefer to call it Homo daliensis rather than Homo longi. But, Seth, that these species names are labels that we use to group things.
Yeah.
They don't, they're human creations, these species names, and we can discuss what a species is and how much variation there should be. But for me, the important issue is you've got a distinct Chinese lineage that apparently evolves for several 100,000 years, alongside the Neanderthal lineage evolving over in Western Eurasia and the Sapiens lineage evolving in Africa. And so over in the Far East, there is this separate lineage evolving through developing its own identity for a comparable period of time.
Amazing. And, the preservation of the skull is so, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's in very good condition.
Yes. I mean, it really does look very freshly preserved, considering it's been in the river deposits at Harbin for something like 150,000 years, probably minimum. It is remarkably well preserved. And it's a shame that it lost most of its teeth. We've just got this one great big molar tooth in it. But in other respects, it's virtually intact. And the internal preservation is also excellent on the inside of the cranium. So in the long run, we will be able to say something about the shape of the brain that was in there from that data as well.
So speaking about the brain, because that actually was my next question, do we know the general cranial capacity?
Yeah. So the CT data suggests it's about 1,420 milliliters.
Oh, wow.
So that's very big, even so that's bigger than the Sapiens average. It's bigger than the Neanderthal average. There are individual modern human and Neanderthal crania that are bigger, but this is certainly well up there in terms of its brain size. It's a very large, very encephalized cranium. And you can see again, if we look at something like Broken Hill, which has got a brain size of a couple of 100 milliliters smaller, you can see this is very pinched in behind the brows. And when we look at Harbin, you can see that it's more expanded behind the brow ridge. So it's more encephalized. The skull is extremely broad. It's still quite low, but it's extremely broad. It's along with one other skull from China, from Zhejiang. These are the broadest skulls that I've ever seen. And overall, Harbin is the biggest single fossil skull I've ever seen. Yeah.
Now, quick morphology lesson. Is that narrowing behind the orbit called something?
Post-orbital constriction.
Post-orbital constriction. That makes sense. Okay.
Try to avoid that.
All right. So, do we know where, because I know the skull was hidden in a well near World War II, I believe. Do we know any idea of its original locality and maybe where to look for more or anything like that?
Well, yes. So as far as we know, so the Japanese had invaded this part of northern China in 1931, I think, and by 1933 they were in occupation of the city of Harbin, and they were building a new railway bridge across the river there. So this is actually kind of one end of the Trans-Siberian Railway. So they're building a railway bridge across the river, and they recruited local people, forcibly or not, we don't know. So in 1933, a team of Chinese workmen were digging in the river deposits for the foundations of this bridge. And this team discovered this fantastic skull in the river deposits. And they realized it was important. The leader of this team of workers didn't want the Japanese to get hold of it, so he took it home with him and put it down an abandoned well, which is apparently a traditional way to hide your treasures in China. He did that because it was a treasure. He put it down the well. And I think, and again, we don't know the whole story, but it's likely that he kept quiet about the whole history and how he'd worked for the Japanese, because this was a shameful thing. Once the Japanese invaders had gone, of course, anyone who worked for the Japanese would not be well regarded. So he probably kept quiet about this for the rest of his life, really, until in his last few months, he told his grandchildren to look down the well, and incredibly, they found the skull down there, still beautifully preserved. So that was 4 years ago. Yeah.
Now that's amazing. I mean, that is definitely not
85 years, as far as we know.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely not a way we typically find skulls.
Nope.
So what can we going forward? I mean, obviously you and your Chinese colleagues are continuing your work and learning new things. What do you think we can glean from this? And what can we expand?
Yeah, in terms of the location, obviously my Chinese colleagues are looking at the locality. They're looking at fossils in the whole Harbin region. And in one of our papers, we've compared the chemical composition of this fossil with fossils from the region that are Middle Pleistocene. And they compare very well in terms of their isotope signatures. So at least the data are consistent that it did come from the Harbin region. And of course, we've got a direct uranium series date on the fossil of at least 146,000 years old. So that's a minimum age. It could be, a fair bit older than that. We will continue our investigations, and maybe we will have more data on that in the future. In terms of obviously, there may well have been a jawbone in the river deposits. That sadly was never recovered. But many animal fossils have been found in that region, and those have been part of our comparative study of the preservation. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so you think the whole dragon man is a little over the media is blowing it up a little more than it should be, do you think? Or do you think they need to calm it down and be like, we've kind of seen this before, this isn't... What's your take on the media's look at this?
Well, obviously, it's a beautifully preserved fossil. It's a very important fossil. And of course, the Dragoman name was a great name. And I think what we can take from it is that, this really establishes that you've got a distinct population history in China. So many people, particularly from the West, have tried to see China through their own eyes. Are there Neanderthals in China? There's Homo erectus in China, there's Heidelbergensis in China. As I say, some of these things have been called Heidelbergensis. So I think what it shows us is that, this area has its own, established human lineage over a long period of time. And we're only just beginning to really learn about that lineage and get its own history. How does it fit into the big picture? And I think that, we can see that there are at least three distinct lineages of later Pleistocene humans evolving in Europe, Asia, and China. And we can see that this is now one of those three lineages. It has its own history. Probably, there were behavioral innovations in this group that we can start to learn about. And one of the interesting things about Harbin is how cold the winters are. Even today, the winters in Harbin, some of the coldest in China, average in some months of -16 centigrade winters. So if these people were surviving in those conditions, and it may well have been even colder. That temperature today is in an interglacial period. These people were surviving under those kinds of winter conditions, which is astonishing, which is probably more than we would say even for Neanderthals. These people must have had ways of coping with that physically, and maybe the large size of this skull is a reflection of the large body size, and large body sizes are favored in colder conditions for many species,
right?
Because you're minimizing your surface area for your volume to conserve heat. So that size may have been an adaptation. The population may have been large-bodied. Perhaps they had subcutaneous fat. Maybe they even evolved some body hair. There's all these things we can speculate about. But almost certainly they had clothing. One would guess these people were wearing clothing. They were building shelters. The use of fire would have been very important too. So we can start to ask those questions. And my Chinese colleagues are starting to look at archaeological sites in the area and whether we can tie some of those to this population.
There's just so much information there, and I know you and your colleagues are going to be putting out what you can when you can, and I'm just so excited to hear more about this skull. It really does show that we can find and learn new stuff in this field every day, and never gets old. But I know you do have some time constraints, so I think we will leave people wondering a few questions about the Harbin skull so they can keep up with your work and your colleagues' work.
Right. Now, you haven't asked me the
oh yeah, what's the big one?
Big question about Denisovans, which of course.
How could I even forget that?
Yeah,
okay.
Most of the press, that was like their first question: is this a Denisovan?
Yeah,
obviously I wondered about that. As soon as I saw this replica with its great big molar tooth, of course.
Yeah.
And so this is one for the future, of course. And we've got a deep lineage in East Asia, based mainly on DNA data, which is called Denisovans. Here we're saying there's a deep Asian lineage based on skull morphology and the jawbone from Zhai. So why aren't they one and the same thing? Well, it would certainly simplify things if we could say this is a Denisovan, and we can then unite the genetic data with the morphological data. But we have to go slowly on this, because first of all, our analyses and the analyses of some other people suggest that there is more diversity in East Asia than just one lineage. So the Zhuqiang fossil, the Marpa fossil from China, they, in our analyses and some other people's analyses, they look different. So there's probably more than one thing in the middle to early late Pleistocene of China. So there's diversity there, which we have to explain. So even if some of them are Denisovans, they may not all be Denisovans. So that's the first question. The Zhai jawbone, of course, from the Tibetan Plateau of China, and yes, it's certainly got big molar teeth with complex roots, which matches the teeth from Denisova cave, which are upper teeth, but morphologically matching. This tooth in here is very large, as big as the Denisovan upper molars, big splayed roots. But big molars are actually phylogenetically primitive, so that doesn't necessarily pin you down to a discrete group. That's a primitive. Having big teeth is a primitive feature, not a specific feature that ties down to specific lineages. So that's a primitive feature, so you've got to be cautious. The Jahe material has been tied to Denisovans via a little bit of proteomic evidence, but it is quite slender. One would like a lot more data to pin that down. And there is mitochondrial DNA data from the cave sediments at Baishia Cave, where that jawbone is to come from. But I know there are some people who are cautious about whether the jawbone really came from Baishia Cave, and that mitochondrial DNA, which is Denisovan from Baishia Cave, is actually from later in time, from 100,000 years and later, whereas that Jahe jawbone is probably at least 150,000 years old, like Harbin. So you haven't got 100% secure connection between Jahe and Denisovans, not yet. One would like more data. And for this group, of course, none of these Chinese fossils yet have any ancient DNA. If we can finally get a really complete fossil with a complete genome sequence of a Denisovan, then we can start to talk. And of course, one thing for the future is to consider some proteomic and genetic work on this fossil. But all of that is at least minimally destructive. So it has to be considered very carefully. We've only got one tooth in that skull. So we've got to, my Chinese colleagues in particular, quite rightly, are going slowly on that one. But of course,
definitely,
we will sort this out with good DNA data from some of these Chinese fossils. And yeah, I'm prepared to say, it's very likely this is the most complete Denisovan fossil we've got so far. But it's not definite. It's a probability.
Okay. Well, that is, we've been looking for a Denisovan anything since we heard of them. One thing that I saw on the media, and I don't know how they did this without having, a full genomic sequence, but they're saying that Harbin might be closer to Homo sapiens than Neanderthals are.
Yes, so on the phylogenetic analyses that we published, so there were 3 papers that were published in this journal, The Innovation. So there's the paper on the dating and the comparisons of isotope signatures and so on for the locality. There's the paper naming Homo longi as a new species, and I wasn't on that paper because, as I explained, I prefer to call it Homo daliensis. And then we have this paper with the description of the fossil and phylogenetic analyses. Now, those phylogenetic analyses used over 600 metrical and morphological traits to compare a whole group of fossils. And in our grouping, the most parsimonious grouping, so the most economical in terms of changes through time, actually showed that the Harbin clade was slightly closer to sapiens than it was to the Neanderthals. So the suggestion was the Neanderthal line branched off first. Well, in fact, if we look at these 4 crania, the Heidelbergensis rhodesiensis line branched off first, then the Neanderthal clade branches off, then you have the separation of the Harbin clade and the sapiens clade. So these 2 are then more closely related to each other. That was the most parsimonious grouping. Now, of course, that immediately provides a conflict with the genetic data on the Denisovans, because on the Denisovan DNA data, the Denisovans are more closely related to Neanderthals than they are to sapiens based on the genetic data. So that's another thing to consider, whether, if this is a Denisovan cranium, then there is a mismatch of our phylogenetic analyses based on morphology and the DNA data. So we've got to resolve that. And it's possible in the long run, the Denisovan Neanderthal divergence is a very early split. And based on morphology, the Harbin sapiens divergence is a very early split. So it's possible that you're really talking about something close to a trichotomy. You might actually have something close to a 3-way split of Neanderthals, of the Harbin clade, and of sapiens. And then it won't take much at the bottom of those trees in terms of, some morphology that evolves in parallel, some DNA that maybe gets transferred between one clade and the next, and you might get the clades grouping with each other in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be close to a trichotomy, and the phylogeny is giving you one answer there and resolving it, and the DNA data is giving you another way of resolving it. So I think that's work again for the future to look at more. But at least, yes, on our phylogenetic analyses, Harbin was closer to sapiens than it was to the Neanderthals.
Amazing. Okay. So we have a lot left to uncover about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course,
Definitely.
as well as doing more analyses of the morphology, so we will also be looking at overall shape comparisons as well as phylogenetic ones to see how they compare. And we hope to move on to look at the internal morphology of the fossil as well. The shape of the brain, the ear bones.
Are the ear bones preserved?
Well, we're not saying yet what's there. We will be looking at data to see what's there, and then moving that work on. The internal structure of the molar tooth, we can look at that. The sinuses, cranial thickness, the meningeal vessel patterns, functional anatomy, the fact you've got this weird combination of what seems to be this huge brow ridge, but a face that's actually quite reduced, tucked under the cranial vault. In a way we find much more in Homo sapiens. So that's one of the things that seems to pull this group towards Homo sapiens, is the retraction of the face. So despite this massive brow ridge and that massive molar tooth, this face is actually much less projecting away from the cranial vault compared with the Neanderthal and with Homo heidelbergensis fossils. They show a greater projection of the face than the Harbin and Dali specimens do. So that's an interesting, it seems to be a parallel evolution with sapiens perhaps, but we've got to try and resolve that. So a very wide face, but one that is surprisingly modern when you look at it.
Definitely, yeah.
But a huge nose, and that's another remarkable thing, is its great big nose and this huge internal volume of the nose. So again, is that to do with respiration? Is it just pulling a lot of air through the nose for high energy lifestyle? Might it be linked with cold adaptation? We don't know yet. So those are again things to be looked at in the longer term.
There's just so much to learn and so many questions. We could go on for hours, but I do think I do want to leave everyone just with a taste. So I thank you very much, Professor. As always, you are one of my favorite guests to have on this show, and you are always so informative and explain everything in such a way that everyone can understand. And I really appreciate that. So thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Seth. I've enjoyed it. Good to speak to you. That's
great. All right. So you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And we will talk soon. And thank you again.
Right. Bye.
Bye.